$40 million in 1975 money poured into a single building in a suburb that most of Chicago had never heard of. A 160-foot dome rose over empty farmland south of Interstate 55, visible from 10 miles in every direction, housing roller coasters, a Ferris wheel, a log flume, circus performers, 200 stores, and the absolute certainty of one California developer that he had solved the oldest problem in the amusement park business. 5 years later, every ride was gone. The building sat locked and rotting for 6 more years after that, while a parade of con men, dreamers, and politicians proposed turning it into a casino, a Hollywood soundstage, a baseball stadium, and an international trade center for the People's Republic of China. None of it happened. And the deal that killed it, the one decision that made all of this inevitable, was already in motion before old Chicago ever opened its doors. The Dome. Start there, because everything comes back to it. In June of 1973, a developer named Robert Brindle walked into a planning commission meeting in Bolingbrook, Illinois, carrying a watercolor painting. Bolingbrook was barely a town. It had incorporated just 8 years earlier in 1965, with a population of around 5,000 people, nearly all of them living in tract housing north of Interstate 55 that had been built by the Dover Construction Company. The original development had been called Westbury. South of the highway, there was almost nothing. Flat Illinois prairie, old farmland, the kind of landscape where the biggest thing on the horizon was a grain elevator. Brindle's watercolor showed something nobody in that room had ever seen proposed for a place like this. A 345,000 square foot enclosed complex with outdoor-style amusement rides, a roller coaster, a Ferris wheel, a log flume, all ringed by specialty shops and restaurants, all under one massive roof. He called it Old Chicago Town. He promised it would put Bolingbrook on the map. The room was full of local officials who had been governing a community that hadn't existed a decade earlier. Bolingbrook was one of those post-war suburbs that had sprouted from cornfields, fueled by the interstate highway system, and a wave of families leaving Chicago for cheaper land and newer schools. By 1973, the population had grown to perhaps 25,000, almost all of it north of the expressway. The village had a couple of strip malls, a school district, and ambition. What it did not have was an identity. Brindle was offering one. He was from Southern California. A developer for 3 decades, he'd gotten the idea after visiting Knott's Berry Farm on a rainy day and finding the park nearly deserted. What if Knott's had a roof over it, he wondered? No rain delays, no winter shutdowns, no lost revenue from weather. In a place like Chicago, where winter lasted 5 months and summer thunderstorms could clear a parking lot in 10 minutes, an indoor amusement park would operate 365 days a year. On paper, the logic was elegant. Amusement parks thrived in summer but died in winter. Retail thrived in winter but slowed in summer. Combine them under one roof, and each would feed the other during its off-season. Brindle called his concept recreational retailing. He incorporated a company called Recreational Retail Builders and started pitching both Bolingbrook and neighboring Romeoville for the site. Both towns wanted the tax revenue. The land sat in an unincorporated gap between the two villages, south of I-55 but north of Romeoville. Bolingbrook moved fast, annexed the land, and won. But here is the first thing that should have worried everyone. Before the village had issued a single building permit, Brindle's construction crews had already poured the foundation. He'd hired Brandt Construction Company, a firm from Southern California that had no experience building in northern Illinois. The foundation they laid didn't meet Bolingbrook's building code. It exceeded setback requirements, for one thing. The village refused to issue permits. Brindle begged for zoning approval, explaining that in Southern California, you got approval as construction continued. This was not Southern California. Illinois had different codes, different soil conditions, different frost lines, different everything. The village said no. The standoff nearly killed the project before it started. Brindle's financial backers, including IC Industries, the conglomerate that owned the Illinois Central Railroad, wouldn't release more money without village approval. But millions had already been loaned and spent. The foundation was in the ground. By May of 1974, 15-foot wide, 40-ton wall sections were being lifted into place by cranes, still without approval from the village. Bolingbrook found itself trapped. They could enforce their own building code and lose what might be the biggest economic development in the village's short history. Or they could approve a project whose builder had already demonstrated he didn't much care about their rules. The earliest proposal had also included a hotel, a monorail, and a golf course, none of which materialized. An attempt to purchase an additional 200 acres for those amenities had fallen through. The dream was already shrinking before the building was done. They approved it anyway. As part of the annexation agreement, Brindle's company would pay to repave and widen Illinois Route 53 to handle the traffic. It was a reasonable demand, but it was also a sign of how much Bolingbrook was betting on this, reshaping its own infrastructure around a project led by a man who had already demonstrated that he preferred to ask forgiveness rather than permission. That decision echoed for a decade. Construction progressed through 1974, but winter slowed everything. Brindle had originally promised a February 1975 opening, which was wildly optimistic. The dome alone cost $2.5 million, a steel and fiberglass crown that rose 16 stories above the Illinois prairie, the tallest structure in Bolingbrook by a wide margin, taller than anything for miles in any direction. The building's footprint covered 57 acres, with a single entrance designed so that visitors would have to walk through the entire shopping corridor, cobblestone walkways mimicking turn-of-the-century Chicago, architecture inspired by Louis Sullivan and the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, before reaching the entrance to what Brindle called the Old Chicago Fairgrounds. $1 million worth of Chicago memorabilia decorated the interior. Gas lamp-style lighting, Victorian storefronts. It was Chicago as a kind of permanent nostalgia, the city's mythic past reconstructed inside a suburban warehouse. The interior was dark compared to an outdoor park. That was one of those things nobody quite anticipated. The dome let in some natural light, but the amusement park section, surrounded by the enclosed mall on all sides, had an atmosphere that visitors would later describe as cavernous, hollow, and strangely noisy. The sound of screaming riders and grinding mechanical rides echoing off concrete walls and steel beams in ways that simply didn't happen outdoors. You got on the log flume ride and got soaked, just like at any outdoor park. Except here, there was almost no sunlight to dry you off. The air smelled like machine oil and funnel cake and enclosed space. On June 5, 1975, an 18-year-old Bolingbrook girl named Michelle Mothy climbed to the top of the dome in a drizzle and tap danced on the roof while a cameraman in a helicopter filmed her for a television commercial. The wind was fierce up there. 2 stone lions were installed at the grand entrance the next day. Everything was being rushed toward opening. On June 17th, between 10 and 16,000 invited guests created traffic jams that stretched up Route 53 all the way to Lisle, 7 miles north. It took half an hour just to drive from Boughton Road to the parking lot. Village officials toured the building and found exposed electrical wiring, incomplete fire systems, half-built shops. Mayor Nora Whipfler told management they would not be allowed to open on June 21st as scheduled. It was simply too dangerous. Construction crews worked around the clock. Because the sprinkler system didn't work, management had to hire off-duty firemen to stand guard throughout the park, an expensive fix to a problem that should never have existed on opening day. After a last-minute inspection, the village relented. On June 26th, an estimated 15,000 people attended the 2-day opening ceremonies of what was advertised as the world's first completely enclosed amusement park. A press release that day described it like this: The $40 million turn-of-the-century shopping and entertainment attraction would introduce the world to the first completely enclosed amusement ride park, with a community of 200 retail stores and eating establishments, all under the same roof. Admission to the park was $5.95, about $30 in today's money, for unlimited rides. A book of 9 individual ride tickets was $3.95. Walking through the shopping mall was free. There was a parking lot tram to shuttle visitors to the front door. The building, seen from I-55, was unlike anything on the suburban landscape. A massive, blocky structure with that enormous dome rising from its center. It looked less like a shopping mall than like a convention center designed by someone who'd been told to make it memorable. You entered through a single grand entrance flanked by stone lions, and immediately the theming hit you. Cobblestone under your feet, Victorian-era storefronts on either side, wrought iron railings, the sound of ragtime piano somewhere ahead. And then, through strategically placed windows cut into the interior walls, you caught your first glimpse of what was waiting in the center. Steel track, spinning lights, the top of a Ferris wheel. The mall corridor was a ring. You had to walk it, past the boutiques, the T-shirt shops, the candy store, the gift shops, before reaching the entrance to the fairgrounds. It was retail architecture as narrative. Inside the park, there were 31 rides. The signature attraction was the Chicago Loop, an aero development corkscrew roller coaster with 2 inversions, only the second modern coaster in the world to turn riders upside down after the corkscrew at Knott's Berry Farm. There was a log flume, a Ferris wheel called the Eli wheel, bumper cars, a tilt-a-whirl, a scrambler, a rotor, a spider, a haunted house, antique cars, a carousel, a yo-yo, the Chicago Cat, a small Pinfari Zyklon roller coaster, and dozens of carnival games, arcades, and shooting galleries. A circus performed daily under the dome. Trapeze artists, clowns, ragtime pianists, high-kicking chorus girls, street magicians, banjo and Dixieland bands, pantomimists, and singing security guards. Over 100 performers worked the complex every day. The mascot was a character named Charlie Baffle. By September, Brindle was claiming 50,000 visitors every weekend. Traffic on Route 53 snarled from the interstate all the way to the next town. 2 sit-down restaurants served the crowds. The Columbian House, owned by a local truck stop operator named Frank Zotcha, and the Old Chicago Beer Garden. Fast food joints filled the rest. Arby's, Wendy's, a Mr. Submarine, a pizza place. For a few months that first summer and fall, it genuinely felt like Brindle might have been right about everything. Then the building started fighting back. The sprinkler system, the same one that had been malfunctioning since before opening, failed again in July, forcing a 6-hour shutdown. Heated discussions erupted between the village and Brindle. In October, a fire broke out in a trash compactor. 500 people were evacuated. Management complained that the fire department was overreacting to a relatively small fire. The fire department did not agree. Miss Teenage Chicago was crowned at Old Chicago that same month. 2 very different stories about the same building, running simultaneously. In November 1975, during a circus performance under the dome, a 56-year-old trapeze artist named Jimmy Troy, billed as the Comedy King of Air, fell 20 feet to his death. He had been a performer for decades. The fall happened in front of an audience. And then, 6 months after the grand opening, came the word nobody wanted to hear: bankruptcy. Brindle's company had run up $8 million in construction cost overruns. The building had cost far more than planned. The mechanical systems didn't work properly, and the specialty shops lining the corridors weren't generating enough revenue to cover the gap. There were 200 storefronts, but not a single anchor store. No Sears, no J.C. Penney, no Marshall Fields, just boutiques, novelty shops, a custom T-shirt store run by a man named Larry Szabo, a tobacco company. Brindle had designed it this way deliberately. He didn't want the big retailers competing with the smaller merchants. It was a charming philosophy for a farmer's market. It was a catastrophic strategy for a $40 million development. 1C Industries, the railroad conglomerate that had been one of the original investors, pushed Brindle out in early 1976. By February 1977, Bolingbrook's village manager, Reed Carlson, announced that Brindle was completely out of the picture now. A new general manager named Clyde Farman took over. The annual payroll was $3.5 million. The amusement tax alone was bringing the village $200,000 to $300,000 a year, plus another $120,000 in sales taxes. Bolingbrook's name appeared in every old Chicago advertisement. There was reason for cautious optimism. Farman called the bankruptcy only a technical readjustment and announced new attractions. In February 1977, Old Chicago set a weekend attendance record. It was the last good news the park would ever have. Because Farman was already watching something to the north, something 60 miles up the highway, something that was about to make every one of Old Chicago's problems permanent. In Gurnee, Illinois, the Marriott Corporation was building a theme park. This is the deal that killed Old Chicago. And the terrible part is that it was already done before Brindle ever showed his watercolor to the Bolingbrook Planning Commission. In 1972, a full year before Brindle's pitch, Marriott had purchased 600 acres of land along the Tri-State Tollway in Gurnee. The Hotel and Restaurant Corporation had decided to enter the theme park business by emulating Walt Disney's strategy, build multiple parks across the country. Marriott planned two nearly identical parks simultaneously, one in Gurnee for the Chicago market and one in Santa Clara, California for the Bay Area. They'd even considered a third near Washington, D.C., in Manassas, Virginia, though local resistance eventually killed that plan. Marriott broke ground in Gurnee in 1974, while Old Chicago was still scrambling to finish construction. On May 29, 1976, less than 11 months after Old Chicago's grand opening, Marriott's Great America opened to the public. Bugs Bunny and the Looney Tunes characters greeted families. Willard's Whizzer, a spiral lift roller coaster, became an instant sensation. The park had multiple themed areas celebrating different eras of American history. A one-hour television special on WLS-TV celebrated the opening. Mel Blanc attended. The comparison was annihilating. Old Chicago sat on 57 acres. Great America sprawled across 275. Old Chicago had 31 rides jammed under a dome with a ceiling that limited how high anything could go. Great America had open sky, no height restrictions, and the ability to build taller, faster, and more thrilling rides every year. Old Chicago was themed entirely around 1890s Chicago. Great America had variety, different lands, different eras, different moods. Old Chicago was backed by a Southern California developer who'd been forced out of his own company within 6 months of opening. Great America was backed by the Marriott Corporation, which had the resources to absorb years of losses while building its brand. Old Chicago was advertised as a half a tank of gas on the road to happiness. Great America didn't need a slogan like that. It had Bugs Bunny. Old Chicago had exactly one competitive advantage. It was open year-round, regardless of weather. But the Chicago market didn't value year-round access enough to choose a smaller, darker, noisier indoor park over a massive, open-air, constantly improving outdoor one. And here was the cruelest irony. The weather advantage that was supposed to save Old Chicago barely mattered even in theory, because the people who most wanted to visit an amusement park in January, kids on winter break, families stuck indoors, were also the people least likely to drive 35 miles down I-55 to a park whose novelty had already worn thin. Great America operated maybe 120 days a year. It didn't matter. On the days it was open, it won, decisively, overwhelmingly, and permanently. 2 million people had visited Old Chicago in its first year. By 1978, that number had collapsed to 900,000. The decline was steepest exactly where you'd expect. Summer weekends, when families made their choice between an indoor park in Bolingbrook and a park 5 times larger in Gurnee. The attendance crash exposed the fatal weakness of the retail side. Without anchor stores, there was no reason for local residents to come back week after week. The novelty shops worked for first-time tourists, but tourists only came once. A mall needs repeat customers, and repeat customers need stores where they want to shop. Fava Shoes opened in late 1976. The Columbian House restaurant closed. For every door that opened, another shut. IC Industries sank $6 million more into renovations in 1977. New rides, the Screamer, the Barnstormer airplane ride, a fun factory play area for younger children with its own admission fee, a laser light show, and colorful sound baffles hung beneath the dome to try to dampen the deafening echo of amusement rides operating in an enclosed space, a problem that was unique to old Chicago and that no amount of money could fully solve. The place was simply too loud. The acoustics of a steel dome over a concrete floor amplified every mechanical grind, every rider's scream, every announcer's call into a disorienting wall of noise. Visitors who came once often described the experience the same way: dark, loud, and strange. The shopping corridor felt hollow. The amusement park felt like a carnival operating inside an airplane hangar. People who loved it remembered the rides and the circus acts and the feeling of riding a roller coaster indoors in the middle of February. People who didn't love it remembered the noise, the lack of sunlight, and the vaguely industrial smell that no amount of theming could fully mask. The management positions became a revolving door. Clyde Farman was eventually replaced. Then his replacement was replaced. A new general manager arrived from Wynn Enterprises, a company brought in specifically to revitalize the amusement park. A separate mall manager was hired, a man named Joseph Villiak, whose mission was simply to fill up the empty storefronts. These were two different people with two different jobs, trying to solve two different halves of the same problem, and neither half could be solved without the other. They staged psychic fairs, Battle of the Drums competitions, antique shows, car and motorcycle shows. A high-diving team from Acapulco performed. A man called the Human Torch literally set himself on fire as entertainment. In one of the more memorable publicity efforts, Old Chicago promoted Public Executions at Old Chicago, a Bastille Day celebration featuring demonstrations of the rack, the cat-o'-nine-tails, and other antique torture devices. The management revolving door spun faster. A general manager from Wynn Enterprises arrived. A separate mall manager was hired. Each one came with a new game plan. None of the games worked. In August 1977, Hollywood director Brian De Palma showed up to film scenes for his supernatural thriller, The Fury, starring Kirk Douglas. His special effects crew sent part of the paratrooper ride crashing through a window of the beer garden. Several Bolingbrook residents worked as extras in the 2-minute sequence that remains the only cinematic record of old Chicago's interior. The local newspaper later quipped that De Palma had become the first person to try to demolish old Chicago. In September, radio DJs John Landecker, Steve King, and Bob Surratt hosted part of the Jerry Lewis Muscular Dystrophy Telethon at Old Chicago. $27,000 was raised at the park. It was a feel-good event at a place that increasingly had very little to feel good about. That same fall, Old Chicago hosted the Pepsi Challenge, one of the first locations in the Chicago area for the famous Taste Test promotion. They donated space to the Fountaindale Theater Project, a local amateur theater group, to perform plays inside the mall. Every week brought a new event, a new promotion, a new attempt to give people a reason to drive down Route 53. The Bolingbrook Jaycees staged their annual fireworks display on the grounds with parachuters and midget racers. None of it reversed the trend. The stores kept closing, one by one, like lights going out along a corridor. By 1978, the mall began closing on Mondays and Tuesdays. The assessed valuation was slashed from $6.6 million to $4 million after the owners appealed, arguing they were barely surviving. The Valley View School District, heavily dependent on the property taxes, faced devastating budget shortfalls and considered legal action. Management flatly denied rumors that Old Chicago was evicting its merchants or converting into a sports complex. In 1979, things got worse. The Old Chicago Tobacco Company caught fire when a tobacco dryer malfunctioned. There were no sprinklers in the storage area, in a building that had been in continuous trouble with its sprinkler system since the day it opened. On the 4th of July, a professional fireworks display ignited prematurely, sending all the pyrotechnics up at once. A technician suffered first and second-degree burns. A 6-year-old was injured. A management spokesman finally admitted what everyone had already sensed, that amusement rides and retail shopping might simply not be compatible under one roof. The full admission price was now required even for parents who just wanted to take a 5-year-old to the Children's Fun Factory. Even that small, punitive pricing decision cost them families. In January 1980, Old Chicago announced plans for a brand-new concert stage with a 3-way sound system, as if the concerts would go on forever. 2 months later, in March, the headline ran, "Old Chicago Shut Forever." Work began dismantling the rides. The Chicago Loop roller coaster was briefly relocated to the Alabama State Fairgrounds, then eventually sold to Canobie Lake Park in New Hampshire, where it operated as the Canobie Corkscrew until 2021, outliving the park that built it by more than 40 years. By the time it was retired, it was believed to be the last operating ride from Old Chicago anywhere in the world. The shops could technically remain open for a time after the park shut down. Some did. Most didn't. Without the amusement park, the mall was just a dim hallway of specialty shops in a suburb with no foot traffic, accessible only by car, with nothing to draw anyone in. It was a shopping center whose anchor had been a roller coaster. 1C Industries filed foreclosure proceedings against itself, technically against Old Chicago Town Partners, in which 1C was the general partner. A spokesman stated that 1C might be willing to absorb a loss of as much as $13 million to sell the property. Negotiations with potential buyers began immediately, officials said. That much was true. What they didn't say was that no serious buyer would emerge for years. What followed was 6 years of increasingly desperate, increasingly surreal attempts to save a building that nobody could afford to use, nobody could afford to maintain, and nobody could afford to demolish. In May 1980, a contract was signed to convert Old Chicago into a massive discount outlet mall, led by a man named Roy Cohn. Not the infamous Roy Cohn of McCarthy-era fame, but a board chairman of an advertising and PR firm. He promised 100 brand-name outlets. 16 companies had supposedly requested leases. The opening was set for August. Then September. Then October. Then April 1981. Rumors surfaced that he couldn't get manufacturers to sign. The option expired without renewal at the end of 1980. Former merchants filed a $5 million lawsuit, a 300-page document covering the money they would lose during the time remaining on their leases and the cost of relocating. By summer, only 4 businesses still operated inside: House of Jade, Super Tease, Inc., the Beer Garden, and Old Chicago Styling Salon. The Beer Garden's owner, Hans Bliege, was defiant. Old Chicago might be broke, he told reporters, but IC Industries was a massive corporation trying to chisel the people who'd invested their life savings in the place. He and 2 other holdouts sued IC to keep the building open. IC was spending $50,000 a month keeping the utilities running. It collected $450 a month in rent from the styling salon, the only tenant still paying. In August 1981, the building was boarded up. Barb Catterman, the village's economic development director, insisted this was not the end. It was the next step toward finding a new use. The building was estimated to be worth $6 to $10 million, but had $65 million in liens against it. Inside, the building was becoming something else entirely. Without heat, without security, without the constant attention that a 500,000-square-foot structure demands, old Chicago began to decay. Roof leaks spread water damage across interior walls. Vandals broke in repeatedly. 2 men were arrested in September 1983, and police acknowledged a growing, persistent problem. 1C proposed stringing barbed wire around the property. The village's zoning board refused, saying they didn't want the place to look like Stateville North, a reference to the nearby state prison. The proposals came like fever dreams. A casino. Bolingbrook said absolutely not. An international motion picture soundstage. The State Film Division toured the building and said it was too expensive, too big, and too far from Chicago. A mayoral candidate named Terry Little wrote letters to seemingly every person in the world connected to the film industry, suggesting old Chicago be converted into a motion picture and television soundstage. He managed to get the Illinois Film Division to tour the building. They concluded it was too expensive, too big, and too far from Chicago. A separate group of investors with credentials in shopping center development, international sales, cattle breeding, and tire sales signed a purchase option, promised to reopen the building within 18 months, and vanished. In 1984, a Missouri land speculator named C.L. Carr signed a purchase agreement with IC. The price was estimated at close to $3 million, barely more than the original cost of the land. Carr promised something glittery. Weeks later, Bolingbrook learned that Carr had been convicted of bank fraud in Arkansas, stemming from sham loans made through friends because Carr himself wasn't creditworthy. Despite the conviction, Carr moved quickly. His plan became clear: demolish the building and sell the land in pieces. In 1985, car dealer Joe Levy bought a corner of the property. The village put up $300,000 to help finance the deal, with Levy repaying through sales tax credits from his dealership. The stone lions that had once guarded old Chicago's entrance ended up at Levy's auto dealership next door. He later moved them to his Skokie car lot and painted them purple and white for Northwestern University's colors. They were eventually sold again to a man in McHenry, Illinois. The lions outlasted the dome by decades. The property was officially declared blighted. The land was worth more than the building. As the building was stripped of anything portable, the mayor of Bolingbrook, Bob Bailey, personally salvaged used Christmas tree decorations, the log flume fountain, and boxes of old souvenirs and equipment still sitting inside the dome. County Board Chairman John Annarino made a final bid to save it. He proposed selling the building to the People's Republic of China as an international trade center. He flew to China with a former village official. He returned without a signed contract, but claimed to have a letter of intent. A week later, he suggested Old Chicago as the site for the 1992 World's Fair. Someone else floated the idea of a White Sox stadium. None of these people had financing. Each proposal existed primarily as a reason to delay demolition for a few more weeks while the building continued to rot. To convince Annarino that nobody was willing to listen anymore, village officials knocked down an exterior wall, ending any possibility that the building could be used for anything ever. The village had passed a demolition ordinance years earlier, specifically to prevent IC from tearing down the building. Mayor Ed Rosenthal had argued that it cost the village nothing to keep trying to sell it. But by 1985, under new Mayor Bob Bailey, the consensus had shifted. The building was a liability, not an asset. A rotting monument to an idea that had arrived too early, built too fast, and competed with an opponent it never had a chance of beating. In February 1986, the village hosted a media event to reframe the demolition as a fresh start. They unveiled a model of hypothetical future development, but had no actual prospects. Annarino nearly stole the show by waving his Chinese letter of intent at the television cameras. In March, the walls came down. In April, the dome. That $2.5 million dome. The one that rose 16 stories over an Illinois cornfield. The one an 18-year-old girl had danced on in the rain while a helicopter circled. the one that sheltered roller coasters and a dead trapeze artist's final performance, and 50,000 people a weekend, quietly sank into rubble. No ceremony, no crowd, no fanfare. By the end of the month, not a trace of old Chicago remained, just the name of a street. The Arena Auto Auction took over the site. Its address, 200 Old Chicago Drive. At the Bolingbrook Village Hall, a mural on the wall still includes Old Chicago in the background, a reminder that the village remembers, even if the building doesn't. The site became an auto auction lot. For over 20 years, the address where 2 million people once rode the world's first indoor corkscrew roller coaster was covered in rows of used cars waiting to be sold at wholesale. The idea Brindle had, the one that bankrupted him, turned out to be right. Just not for him. In 1981, the year Old Chicago was boarded up, the West Edmonton Mall opened in Alberta, Canada, with an indoor amusement park called Galaxyland. In 1992, the Mall of America opened in Bloomington, Minnesota, with a theme park that would become Nickelodeon Universe. Both were enormously successful. Both were built on the same core insight Brindle had articulated in 1973. Combine retail and amusement under one roof, and each would draw traffic for the other year-round. The difference was structural, and it was exactly the difference Robert Brindle had dismissed from the beginning. Both those malls were anchored by major department stores. The rides were the attraction, but the stores were the business. Brindle had inverted the formula, building a theme park with a mall around it, filling the mall with specialty shops that couldn't survive without the park, then watching the park collapse when a bigger competitor opened an hour's drive north. The concept was visionary. The execution was fatal. In January 2020, Amazon paid $50.5 million for the 119-acre site. More, adjusted for inflation, than Brindle's entire complex had cost to build. The plan was a distribution center, another massive warehouse in Amazon's relentless Chicago area expansion. But Roger Clark, the same Roger Clark who'd been a village trustee in 1983, who'd said, "Who cares?" when asked about saving old Chicago, was now the mayor. He'd been mayor for 34 years. He balked at the proposed 100-foot-tall windowless metal structure, taller than any building in Bolingbrook, and at the $15 an hour warehouse jobs. The irony, that the village's longest-serving mayor was now blocking a development on the same land where its most famous development had once failed, seemed lost on no one. The site, as of this telling, sits largely empty. A street called Old Chicago Drive still runs along the edge. Meanwhile, 50 miles north in Gurnee, Great America, the park whose opening had sealed Old Chicago's fate, is still running. Six Flags bought it from Marriott in 1984. It now has 16 roller coasters, draws over 3 million visitors a year, and sits on land worth a fortune. It has never closed for more than a season. It has never gone bankrupt. It has never needed a barbed wire fence to keep out vandals, or a convicted bank fraudster to buy its carcass, or a county board chairman to fly to China with a letter of intent. The dome has been gone for 40 years now, replaced by nothing at all, on land that turned out to be worth more than everything Brindle ever put on it.